So my name is Joel Valencia. I use he, him pronouns. I am the founder and executive director of Evergreen Collective, which is an organization that focuses on supporting grassroots, BIPOC-led and serving nonprofits, primarily here in San Mateo County, in Santa Clara County, and a little bit in San Francisco County. But I actually connect with organizations across the state and even across the country. And I started this organization because I felt that there was a gap in not just resources, but thinking about ways how the leaders in our communities, in redline communities of color in particular, how we access the resources that are available, what mechanisms are in place or are not in place for us to actually connect with the people who make the decisions to move those resources into our communities so that our great leaders can go out there and do the work that they know how to do best because they are most proximate to the issues that are happening in their own communities, in our own communities. So it gives me great pleasure, and I was very excited to be able to be the facilitator of our incredible panel today. We have 4 leaders here who are going to be speaking about different parts of the work in general that's going into funding climate resilient work and some of the needs and the challenges related to that funding, to those funding mechanisms, to how we make those resources available, both locally and regionally and in the movement in general. So the way that this session is going to work, we're going to go through a bit of a Q&A here. I'll ask questions to our great panelists for about 50 minutes. And then we'll transition to an exercise where each of you will have the opportunity to contribute your thoughts and your feelings about what you heard today, but also what you're bringing with you. Because the wisdom that's in this room is incredible, and the success of this movement really depends on all of us. So let's go ahead and get started a little bit here. I'll introduce everyone quickly by name and title, and then I'll have everyone speak to your own experiences and your work. So to my right, I have Supervisor Noelia Corzo of District 2 of the County of San Mateo. All the way at the end over there, we have Aaron Johnson, Vice President of the Bay Area region of PG&E. And then over here, we have Ash McNeely, the Executive Director of Sandhill Foundation. And lastly, but not leastly, we have Amar Azucena Sid, who is the Deputy Director of Community Investments and Planning for the California Strategic Growth Council. So the structure of my Q&A is going to go like this. We're going to do a pop. We're going to start with what the purpose is, what our shared visions are. We'll then talk a little bit about some of the outcomes that we want to see happen for our communities in partnership with our communities. And then we'll end with a little bit of conversation about what it's going to take to actually make some of those outcomes happen before, again, we turn it over to the audience to contribute and to think about some of those same things. So let's start by having each person say a little bit about yourselves and your why in this work. Who are you, and why do you think it's important for you to actively participate in and support climate resiliency initiatives here in San Mateo County, both from a personal perspective and through your respective professional roles? And we can start with the supervisor.
I knew you were going to start with me. Good morning, everyone. My name is Noelia Corzo, and I was elected to the Board of Supervisors in November, started in January, so I'm about 9 months in. Thank you. I'm the first Latina in the history of our county to be in this role, and thank you. And so I'll kind of start off by saying that for me, as someone who grew up very low income, literally within half a block of a freeway, I know what it's like to be impacted by climate issues and to be in that very vulnerable group that we all want to help support. And what that's meant for me is that I've done a lot of learning. I'm still learning when it comes to climate resiliency. And I think growing up, I knew that things were different in my neighborhood than other neighborhoods, right? Less trees, less lighting, more crowded streets, etc. And so I was always really interested in doing something about that. So as a young adult, I got involved in some neighborhood cleanups and actually continued to do that. I think for me it's really important to use my platform that I have now to be a bridge to vulnerable communities, and that's not easy work to do. It's very time consuming to meet people where they are, especially when they don't have a lot of time on their hands or they need to buy in to some of the changes that we want to see in our community. So, in my role now, what I hope to do and what I'm in process of doing is really going to where people are. So, for example, my team, we're planning on doing some tabling outside of church communities where we know people already gather, outside of schools, at bus stops, to really bring resources to where people are, because expecting them to come to us sometimes is too big of a lift. Another idea I've had, and then I'll hand it over, but another goal of mine is to really, we have Samaritan House in our county, and they do so much work with our communities most vulnerable. And when people go to pick up backpacks or pick up food or, pick up a Thanksgiving meal or, gifts for the holidays, people are already there. That's like a really key opportunity that I think we could all try to better leverage to get resources to people where they're already going and where they are more receptive, right? Where they are present. So that's one of my most recent ideas. But I think for me, it's really important that I use the platform that I have to educate people, to provide resources, and also to find those opportunities to advocate for either more funding or having more of an equity lens when it comes to certain programs, et cetera. Thank you.
So I'm Ash McNeely. I'm executive director at Sandhill Foundation, and I guess to always represent the foundation, I talk about myself personally. I guess I'd just share that I've lived here on the peninsula for the last 36 or so years, and really resonated with some of the things that Greg said in the earlier panel about the changes. And I do remember in the 80s there being orchards at the south end of San Mateo County and sort of northern Santa Clara around San Antonio Road. And I also remember when the air was much clearer. It just feels like overall, over the years, there's a haze that's come in across the entire area that wasn't there before. At the Sandhill Foundation, which was founded in 1995 by Tom and Susan Ford, they made their money in real estate development on Sandhill Road and always have had a mission to therefore give back to this community. So 100% of what we do is focused on San Mateo County. And our mission is to support the economic prosperity, mobility, and wellness of families with low income, and to advocate for a safer, more resilient environment here in San Mateo County. So, gosh, to that end, I mean, I was so inspired by the panelists before. Pretty much all of them were our grantees. And a couple of years ago during COVID, we did some strategic planning and thought about the history of our environment grant making had been primarily open space preservation and environmental education focused, so really thinking about the youth and the next generation of environmentalists. But we started to think about, during COVID, we started to think about what could we do around climate, specifically climate change in the local community. And there's just so many funders in Silicon Valley who give to the large national or international environmental organizations. But what I believed that we could bring a different lens to that conversation and think about it at the local level. So that has led us into these relationships with many of the speakers today. which has been exciting, and I hope will grow. So part of my mission today is to meet all of you, and please bring me your ideas. We'll talk more about that later.
Hi, good. You hear me? Yeah? All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Mara Susana Sid, Deputy Director for Strategic Growth Council. How many folks have heard of the Strategic Growth Council? Okay, good mix. Awesome. For those that don't know us, we are an office within the governor's office. We're also akin to being the government kind of CBO at state agencies. And I before I get into the Strategic Growth Council and why I'm with this organization, this state agency, kind of bringing it a little bit back to the why I'm here, why I want to be in these spaces. I would say, like earlier discussions, my community has been greatly impacted for generations of forced removal. Our identity has been really diminished, really thinking about how colonialism has really taken a lot from us. We mentioned earlier about thrivance, resiliency, all great things in the face of adversity, right? In the face of how our people have been erased, removed, and diminished. And that's kind of where I come from. My community, my identity is Chicana, Indigenous, Yaqui. I'm considered a first generation. I was born and raised in Sacramento, and thinking about how I was raised, it was really rooted in civil rights, thinking about justice for farm workers, thinking about how we can expand and think back to land rematriation for Indigenous communities. That all played a role in how I kind of forced my perception into being a critical thinker about the land that I was surrounded by. I was raised in a community that was deemed the most disadvantaged in the Sacramento area. Didn't have that wherewithal as a small child. It was just the community I was raised in. But did understand that we had higher crime rates. We did not have great infrastructure. Very scared of over-policing in our community. It was a predominantly Black and brown community with a high migration of East Indian. We also had Hmong population. And there was a lot going on without a lot of services, without a lot of benefits. And so as I aged in this space, it was really that question of why. Like, why don't we have the things that other communities have? Why is my school the worst school in the district? Why is it that I am one Chicana, Latina, Indigenous person that is in an advanced class? Like, these things don't make sense to me. And so I kind of started thinking about how do we find the root causes? And a lot of it was going back for me to transportation, to access and mobility, to redlining, right? Like, why were we in these communities to begin with? Why were we not being able to move to different spaces, having access to capital to go into different spaces? And then also seeing the trajectory of our health within the Black and brown communities. So that kind of moved my existence into politics, thinking about how do we change this from a political space. That became not the lens for me. It was more on policy. How do we address these through policy? How do we start righting the wrongs? Thinking about reparative structures to the structures that we're existing in. Most of my work was in transportation, predominantly within equity, transit, and access and mobility. And now I'm at the Strategic Growth Council, where we're thinking about how do we invest in communities differently? How do we ensure that communities actually have access to the capital improvement programs that we have? How do we break the barriers to these large infrastructure programs, making them available with technical assistance for application, for implementation? And then how do we go a bit beyond that? How do we think about capacity and readiness within these structures? How do we make sure that the social infrastructure is at the forefront of our funding? How do we institutionalize funding operations for communities that have been harmed by our systems and structures? And so that framework really helps me think about climate emergencies all the time, right? We're thinking about where our climate is kind of harming the same communities that are facing and have faced redlining in the past. And so how do we address that in a more holistic, systemic approach, At the Strategic Growth Council, we're tasked with that. We're tasked with ensuring that our funding has longevity for thriving, healthy, and climate communities. So I'll stop there, and then we'll get into a conversation.
Good morning. My name is Aaron Johnson, and I'm, as was introduced, I'm PG&E's Regional Vice President for PG&E. I want to talk about both, to give a little sense of my why, my background, and then the role I'm in, because I think it transitions into some of the programs we're going to talk about today. So I got into the energy space. I'm an engineer by background, and I got into the energy space to work on clean energy. I got a scholarship to go to Australia to do solar cell device physics research, and I got really interested in energy policy issues and the programmatic application of energy technologies rather than actually designing them. So fast forward, I've worked at PG&E for about 15 years. I've led solar development at the company. I've led electric vehicle charging infrastructure at the company. I like to take on what comes next, and interestingly, on 48 hours notice, I was transferred to wildfire mitigation after the wine country fires. So I think my career is a bit of analogous to what we've experienced in this space, which is really going from, in the energy space, talking about fighting climate change to having to figure out how we're going to adapt because it's coming much faster than we originally thought. Now I'm currently in a role, we've moved one of the reforms at PG&E coming out of the bankruptcy that we had several years ago was to try and make the company a little bit smaller. We can be a very big entity. We're in 48 counties in California. So we set up a regional model. So we have 5 regions, roughly equal in size among customers and infrastructure. So I have the Bay. It's really the inner Bay Area. It's Alameda, Contra Costa, San Mateo, and San Francisco County. And we have 5 operating divisions within there, 5 of our 19 divisions where the crews go out of and do all the work in your community. So along those lines, we have a number of grant programs that have been tailored around this idea of how do we become more of a local entity, a local utility. So I wanted to touch on a few of those. We have first a Resilient Hub grant program. This makes $25,000 and $100,000 grants to help figure out what does resiliency look like in a community? How do you support a local community? As we've seen more and more natural disasters, PG&E has recognized that our role goes beyond infrastructure to an elements of community support when there are power outages, when there are disruptions in the source of service that folks very much expect to be 24/7, but can be very challenging under the weather conditions we've seen the last, growing over the last few years, the more extreme weather we've been seeing. The nice thing about this program is the $25,000 grants can even be for feasibility of what you might want to set up. And examples of past grantees are, 2 refrigerated containers within the food bank in Contra Costa and Solano counties, and a program that goes out and has youth going out to work with the community in Oakland on installing solar panels and batteries and working with local community organizations to figure out how to improve awareness around energy issues. So there's a variety of different programs. We have Better Together Nature Positive Innovation Grant Program, which is a $100,000 grant also to figure out for climate adaptation and nature improvement. How do we help? What does a local program look like that might improve nature's own resiliency to the climate change that we're experiencing? And then finally, probably one of the things I'm most proud of our company being associated with is the Menlo Park Safer project with the, I'm going to say it wrong, San Francisco, did I get it close? JPA, been out a couple of times. We have the Ravenwoods substation and the Cooley substation, which are there at the base of the Dumbarton Bridge, north and south. And those really face the prospect. I mean, there's over 300,000 customers that get their service through those substations, and they will not withstand the level of bay rise that we're expecting to see. So we have to change how we design our infrastructure and what those programs look like, and we're really proud to be sort of one of the matching supporters, along with Facebook, now Meta, I guess, to be some of the matching funds for the FEMA grant that they've received to really move a lot of that community resilience along the bayfront there forward.
Thank you. So as you all can see, we have an incredible panel here today with extraordinary experiences and knowledge. This question's for Ash and Aaron. And Ash, if you can start. You've both worked with your respective organizations, serving the local community for some time now. How have each of you seen community needs related to climate change shift over the last 5 to 10 years here in the county? And what are some of the proposed solutions that these communities are already and ready to begin implementing once funding is available to do so?
We need this. Well, I think Aaron just spoke to some of the really clear weather-related climate impacts that we're seeing. I mean, there's now regular flooding. There's regular oppressive smoke. There's just a whole host of fears that this brings up for people, and I'm excited that Thrive is leading a more concerted and organized emergency response process for the county. And I think additionally, another change I'm seeing is that the county is really working hard there's a lot more entities that are set up to address climate-related issues. I mean, we have talked about the Joint Powers Authority associated with the creek, the Office of Sustainability, we have Climate Ready San Mateo County, we have One Shoreline, Peninsula Clean Energy, amazing developments over the last 5 to 10 years. And obviously supportive supervisors. So these are great. These are great. But as an individual family philanthropy, how do you plug in and try to make a difference within the context of that? That feels that's where the challenge is, and that's I think it's hard for the nonprofits to figure out how to plug in. It's hard for us as individual philanthropists to also try to figure out how to fit in. And make a meaningful difference. And I mean, every individual is feeling that, right? But the developments that have occurred with the increase in, from my perspective, cities, utilities, governments generally asking for more community input in a really much more, and there being a system to engage with and contract with organizations like those hosting our event today, for cities to get that input and have a much deeper, more authentic data set to inform policies and decisions that are being made. That development is significant and extremely exciting. So, from our perspective at Sandhill Foundation, continuing to support the community engagement and, empowerment of advocacy at the community level is key, and we're going to keep doing that. I also want to say that I think one of the outcomes of that is more representation, more diverse and appropriate representation on decision-making bodies, and that is starting to happen. I don't feel like we're there yet at all, but it's starting to happen. And to that end, I think another thing that Sandhill Foundation can do to help is provide more support for leadership development programs. So we're really proud to be supporting Green Foothills and its leadership development, and other programs that exist in the community that do that kind of work. So those are some of the answers that came to mind for me. Aaron?
Yeah, thanks, Ash. I think I touched on it in my opening, but what I've observed really changing is this focus from fighting climate change to climate adaptation. When I think of my involvement both with trying to launch support for electric vehicle charging at businesses, much of which was concentrated on the peninsula, since it was this is 5-7 years ago, in the very early area where we were seeing at the time almost half of the EVs in the country were concentrated in the Bay Area. And then I saw it with customer adoption of solar, even home battery systems. There was a lot of interest in those things. Now we're seeing those things as much more present in a lot of communities, not in a lot of disadvantaged or vulnerable communities, but those technologies are becoming more ubiquitous, much more present. And when I'm out in community meetings, discussions, getting feedback from local elected officials, there's a lot more conversation now about the support for the community and the adaptation issues than there is about the technology. We have entities like Peninsula Clean Energy, right? We have this sort of fragmenting of what was traditionally a very traditional monopoly in the utility business, and now for many of you, your electrons will come through Peninsula Clean Energy. Some folks still get theirs through PG&E. We maintain the wires. People have interested in microgrid programs. Lots of people have their own provision of service with solar and batteries, and the cost for that keeps coming down. So it's very much a changing space, but what we see is there's still that need for that 24/7 provider and that support function that's traditionally played by the utility, and for us to serve as a bit of an aggregator around different programmatic offerings and helping customers who, not all of whom want to think about their energy use. They just want to, as Amory Levin says, they just want cold beer and hot showers, right? They don't necessarily want to think about the electrons and the molecules that are providing their service. Couple of programs that we do to respond to that adaptation that I wanted to highlight are, so we give a foundation grant for the PG&E Foundation to the California Fire Foundation, just south of $1 million a year, and they give out grants in the range of $5,000 to $25,000 for local community, for fire safe councils. So what does the community want to actually do for a local project? We don't know that best, so we want to partner with an organization that can help support those types of programs. We have a lot to do with our infrastructure to make it more fire safe, fire resilient. Communities want to do things to protect their communities. How can we support that type of effort? We've also had a lot of ask for microgrids as a resiliency concept. Some college campuses. We've seen, we had a pilot project with the Blue Lake Rancheria up in Humboldt County that I was part of helping get off the ground. So we want to be able to support these. So we're really happy to announce just in the last few weeks, we're launching a microgrid enablement program. And again, the idea here is there is some funding for the infrastructure, but really what we can provide is the PG&E expertise in the energy space for communities that want to invest in their resiliency, and there's an opportunity to provide the technical support to navigate a lot of that, which is, I think, a barrier to participating in that, because a lot of communities reach out to us as that concept has come out, and they don't necessarily know where to start. And so not only can we help provide advice, but we can also help with the very technical elements of how you design that.
Thank you. So this question is for Amar and Supervisor Corzo. This time we can start with Amar. Many of the proposed solutions out there are both exciting and ambitious, of course, very necessary. From your statewide and countywide perspectives, can you talk a little bit about the funding gaps that you perceive, what you might think it would actually cost for the government and its community partners to fully implement some of the most compelling solutions that you've run across, and just any other major gaps in funding for implementation that you've had experience with?
Yeah, it's hard to put a price tag on generations of restorative structures that we actually need to invest in. I think where we're at as the state, there making a concerted effort to start chipping away at some of this, especially over the last decade where we've had, I would say, as a country from California, we have the most investments in thinking about climate adaptation, mitigation, especially with GGRF or the CCI funding at the state level. For the Strategic Growth Council, that's baked into our mission, right? Thinking about how we fund solutions that are people-centered. Climate is at the forefront of that, and we've had a very small operating budget to do this, but we've had some very large programs that have come our way to help support this. One of the programs that we have right now is the Community Resilience Centers program. This program kicked off 2 years ago with really amazing staff level interest to really think about all the things that we've learned over the last decade in community funding and climate funding, to have iterative processes that actually address some of the community's real needs when you come to think about infrastructure as a whole. And so the need far exceeds the funding amounts that we have. This program was set to be a 3-year, kind of 3-round funding opportunity. It was cut in this last budget, moving over to the bond structure over the next couple of years, so we'll see what that looks like. So we will have a considerable gap. We just closed our first round of applications. We have about $100 million to give out. We had 190 applications requesting over $700 million. From this funding pot, we have 3 types of grants. We have planning, project development, and then the implementation. And so we structured this in a way where it's to help tier and build out the capacity of communities that are coming in for these types of funding, right? How do we actually plan for resilience that's really community-driven, community-based? And then how do we support them in going through the life of these funding structures so that they can have that technical assistance through the project development stage and then into implementation, right? Implementation is the large ticket item here, and what we're seeing already just on a quick scan of applications is our threshold for these projects were about $10 million. This is very like scratching the surface at the need of most of the projects that are coming in. So when you think about retrofitting buildings, there's a huge price tag that you unearth even after you start beginning these projects. And then when you think about inflation, when you think about the cost of moving goods and services, those dollars also are then kind of catapulted into, you know, 10s, 20s, $30 million for something seemingly that the communities may have thought might not have been so high cost. I would also say in these kind of climate funding structures, there's a huge gap in long-term operations to really stand up the resilience centers as a whole, right? We're thinking about this differently. We want to ensure that communities are building trust within the community so that community can go to these centers instead of having to leave their community where they don't have any connection to. But in order to do that, we also need to fund operations, and this is long-term operations that generally at the state level, most state funding programs do not do that, right? And so it's other opportunities through philanthropy or through mini grants to actually do that operation component. And so when we're thinking about this, we bake operations as a small component into this program to really pilot out how this looks so that we can, again, staff up the community centers to actually do the work, to actually do the rehab, but also to build the programs and structures that bring people there and to keep people there in the community. So there is quite a bit of a gap at the state level, but I think, again, we're chipping away at some of the huge costs that we're going to incur. I think one last thing to point out is without addressing any of this right now or even a decade ago, we would be really up a creek, even more so than we are right now, right? This last year, all of the state was hit with these climate emergencies, not just extreme heat, but extreme wind, right? So our insurances were tapped, right? And so when you think about the costs, like those insurance programs are now kind of leaving the state. And so those are a lot, like a huge cost incurred on communities that are impacted, that then when you're looking at recovery, how can you ensure that they're going to have longevity in those spaces if they don't have that protection of insurance? So there's a lot of factors baked into what that gap looks like.
Ooh, hard act to follow. Thank you so much. I just learned a lot from you. I appreciate that. So my response to this question is going to be a little bit more simple. I think what's really key is recognizing that, within one community, let's say within one city, you have different parts of that city that are going to be impacted differently. And so I think remembering to that being hyper local is really a key in terms of like how we think about funding and what each different community needs. So there are some, I would say, like lower cost strategies, which include incorporating climate resilience considerations in local government policies. I'll kind of give one example. So one right now that's happening in my district is an initiative being led by the mayor to fund a new stormwater infrastructure. And this is something that, it's obviously not the county government doing, but for me as a supervisor, using my platform to really support that and elevate that is absolutely necessary, because some of this work needs funding that there aren't other sources for. Some longer term and higher cost funding gaps, I think, are really, if we were to implement it's a wordy title here. So our multi-jurisdictional local hazard mitigation plan, that would be, upwards of hundreds of millions of dollars to fund. And that's not something that we currently have, but it sounds like we need to apply for some funding from the state on that. But really for me, in my district, I would say 2 to 3 extremely vulnerable communities or neighborhoods, and those areas, when you look at them individually, need a lot more support, and there is some funding available. For example, the Air District, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, has some funding available for SB 1000 communities, one of which I have in my district. But those communities need the extra support to apply to those kinds of programs, right? And so that is, I think, an area where my team and I are stepping in to try to, give folks reminders, additional support. But there definitely is a funding gap, and I'll admit this is not my area of expertise. But it's definitely one where, as I'm learning, making those connections and trying to bridge those gaps is really key. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to give that first section of purpose a little room to breathe, for us to really get to know our panelists and to see that we have a shared purpose in the work that we're all trying to do, whether it's at the hyper-local level or at the state level or internationally, which I know some folks are doing as well. For the next section, we're going to move a little bit more quickly, so I do ask that folks take 1 to 2 minutes per answer. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the outcomes that we would love to see, again, for our respective organizations, for our communities, in partnership with the folks that we work with. So this first question is for Erin and Amar. As we've discussed, we've recently seen in San Mateo County neighborhoods, there's been flooding, wildfire smoke, hazardous heat waves, and droughts. What are some of the most urgent changes that need to occur within your respective sectors or organizations, and in the regional climate resilience movement in general, to meet this moment? What changes need to happen so that the communities and the partners that you serve can actually get the resources they need to implement community-led solutions? And we can start with Erin.
Thank you. So a couple of thoughts. In answering this, I'm going to step back and go big picture a little bit. I think we need 2 things. We need more outreach and engagement locally, and we need more long-term planning. So let me touch on each briefly. We are engaging in a process around community engagement. Thanks to, I want to give credit to the state for all the utilities under the state's jurisdiction. They've started a 4-year process of doing climate vulnerability assessments and an accompanying community engagement plan. And so we've just completed ours in the Bay Area. And I'm really proud because one of the things we did in partnering with a lot of the community-based organizations, many of you in the room get tapped to participate in these sort of things that are led by, say, an infrastructure company like PG&E. We actually paid the participants so that they would be able to really provide their expertise over a longer period of time and help us really build a climate resiliency plan for the community that had significant local input in it. I think those types of processes, engineers, we like to do things like look at the age of assets, the health of those assets, draw lines on maps. And there are real people behind that, and we need to do a better job, I think, going forward of engaging with the community to really understand where we should be doing what. I think it's also how leadership shows up. We had a really, really bad storm season this year, and a lot of communities in the Bay had, sometimes even multi-day outages, which has been, by our recollection, about 30 years since we had outages of that duration really in the Bay on that level, since the storms in the mid-90s and a little before my time in this business, but a lot of the folks who've been around for a while will talk about that. And just about every community in San Mateo County wanted us to show up, and I chose, as the vice president for this area, to show up in East Palo Alto and get my ear chewed off by the community there for the outages, as opposed to my friends in Atherton or wherever it may be that were also experiencing those outages. And I think it's important for leadership to show up, for a company that serves all communities like PG&E to show up and represent not just in some of the communities whose voices are traditionally louder and get to executives at a company faster than in a community like East Palo Alto, but it was important to set that example for the team and to show up in the community in that way. And then I think the other piece is long-term planning. We are starting to, at PG&E, plan out on longer time horizons with climate adaptation as part of our standards. We're seeing a lot of transformer failure in these major heat events. Transformers in the Bay are often designed, they're a little cheaper to build, we want to manage costs, to have that nice cool breeze come in the evenings and cool down the equipment naturally. It's a little less expensive, helps keep your utility bill down. Well, when we start having these heat storms at a level we haven't, and for longer duration, those transformers never cool down, and we start seeing more failures of them. And so we have to change standards like that and replace equipment over time and build it to a higher standard, which often means a more expensive piece of equipment. But we need to make those changes and get out in front of thinking about them and what the climate will look like for infrastructure that's going to be around for 30 to 50 years. What is it going to look like? What's it going to need to stand up to in the future? And so we're starting to integrate that as well in that process. I talked about age of assets and things like that, is looking at the communities that are served by particular infrastructure. I live in San Francisco, and when I look at where the infrastructure is underground and where it's not in the city, I've never compared it with redlining maps, but you can imagine that I generally see the wealth of the neighborhood is proportionate to how much undergrounding there is. I don't have the history of why those choices were made, but it's not hard to make a connection. And so I think we want to incorporate how the communities have actually been served, not just the age of the infrastructure or the state of that infrastructure, but what community is there. And we're building, early days, hard for engineers, but hard to quantify it sometimes, but we're trying to find ways to build that into our long-term planning process so that it's about the people who live there and what the past is there, not just the state of the infrastructure. So again, more community engagement and more longer-term planning focused on that community. A couple of the things that I think are really going to make a difference.
Thank you.
I can quickly add just to that, because I think planning is extremely important. I would say we need to find and really have long-term resources to pay for that planning, to pay for capacity building. And so what capacity building readiness means is community has an understanding, a wherewithal of what's actually taking place. We're funding kind of listening sessions, funding community to provide feedback to the local governance, state governance, so that we can really ensure that whatever programs we're responsible for can actually meet the needs of community. But at the same time, we need to kind of ensure that that community is building out those partnership structures. So if they're building out those community plans, that our local governance, regional governance, and state governance are like validating those plans and really making those plans whole, right? Because if we're supporting the capacity, if we're supporting community plans and we do nothing with it, or our state governance or local governance creates their own planning mechanisms that really move those plans out, then we're really not showing up the way we should be. And I also think that when it comes to what we can do for community to fully like realize this is provide space, right? Provide space that goes above and beyond what infrastructure actually means, so that we're able to resource all the things that community needs. So again, I talk about social infrastructure, just funding things that may not have a checkbox from the state governance structure, but being able to fund that in a way that makes sense for community. So finding ways to do childcare, finding ways to feed people, finding ways to give vouchers, transportation, being creative in a way that's not necessarily creative from a person's perspective, but creative at the state and governance level to actually make those things come to fruition.
Thank you so much. For the next question, I would love to hear a little bit from Supervisor Corzo and Ash. What can we do collaboratively to leverage the available resources that we do have that are in our region to secure additional support from state and federal funding opportunities? And if we can start with Ash.
Oh, I think you should start with.
Okay, with Supervisor Corzo.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Thank you for the question. I think this summit is a really good example of how we take a step towards leveraging resources better. Getting folks in a room to really hear from each other is key. In addition to that, I think thinking regionally can also help us. We've seen some work like that around housing, with a regional housing bond being on the table soon. Another example is the City and County Association of Governments recently applied, or I don't think recently, I think it's been a while, applied for the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resilience Program Adaptation Planning Grant for a one watershed approach to watershed and storm water management. I think for me, one of the things that I'm doing is, scheduling consistent meetings with some of our, with our higher office elected officials, just so that we have lines of communication open. But I think, ongoing communication is really key. In addition to that, I think about all of the different spaces I walk into and when I learn about funding opportunities, and it's honestly difficult to try to keep track of it all. But our County Office of Sustainability, they are the experts in terms of keeping our state and funding opportunities on the radar, and so I do have consistent meetings with them as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to echo about the information and sort of how the information comes down to the community level and how complex and confusing that can be. And I really appreciate Petra's newsletter that she sends with the advocacy. I can't remember what it's called. What's it called, George? The Policy and Advocacy newsletter. Excellent resource. Everybody should sign up for that one. Because she really tracks sort of all the stuff going on and sends you a link. I think also it's really important, this coalition building. I actually would be so curious to hear, Amaro, like what looks like a good application to you. I mean, if we at Sandhill could fund things, which we do, things like this summit, and the cost of consultants like Joel, or the convening time, or the stipends for representation, of community members and childcare and food and all those things. Like, that's an easy thing for us to fund at the local level, but what is it that the group needs to come together to create that is really attractive, right, to actually either of your programs? What does quality look like in that regard to you? Would honestly be my question, because I want to link. We're flexible. You know, we can give general support, we can give multi-year support, we can fill in the holes around what the government funding or the more specific project-based funding that comes perhaps from a utility company, or or at the county level, supervisor budget, whatever. We can fill the gaps, but I want to be able to provide some advice about what sets them up.
Those are great questions, and I think a great next step after this panel to just bring a group together to have that conversation. I think there are probably quite a few people in here who would love to be a part of that and discuss that more. So we'll move on to the last section here before we break out into the groups. And this one's about process. And so we've got a few minutes. We'll go quickly through these. 2 last questions, y'all. So this one's for Ash and Amar. What actions are your organizations taking already to lower barriers for CBOs, small nonprofits, faith-based organizations, and so on, to access your grant programs? Can you provide examples where this has been successful and describe the impact you saw through a local project?
For the Strategic Growth Council, we've really had an iterative process for all of our programs. So when we first had a swath of funding about a decade ago, there was huge eligibility restrictions in there. And so over the last decade, it's really loosening up those requirements, having community really communicate, listen. Like, we're listening to community on who can come into these funding sources, what are the challenges to come into those sources, what are the requirements they need to come into the sources. It's been a really great collaborative space where we've been able to kind of navigate some advocacy and policy structures, have our partners do some advocacy to change legislation, to change some of our program requirements, to expand eligibility. And I would say successes over the last couple of years are really that expansion of how community-based organizations can come in. If they're lacking something, we're providing technical assistance at the application level or through the life of the program if they're awarded, so through implementation. So funding technical assistance so that we have that ability that's not going to jeopardize like a competitive structure, but being able to support it through third-party support. I think the other thing is really a success is we have piloted and supported through community development and advocacy is advanced pay structures for a community-based organization. We know some of our funding structures have these kind of like large, I would say, ticket items in these projects, and so you're expecting CBOs to really hold the bag and invoice like months and months later on some of these very large ticket items, like doing charging infrastructure that may be $500,000 that they may not actually have. So building out a way to pilot what advanced pay looks like for community-based organizations. I think this week alone the governor signed that legislation, so it's no longer a pilot, it's expanding that program for advanced pay. It's also looking at, again, that eligibility to ensure that tribal communities are eligible for a lot of our programs as well as non- or unincorporated communities, right? So kind of removing that structural barrier of having a state or local governance like being partnered. Like, we are able to have tribal governance, both federally recognized, non-recognized, and tribal serving organizations come in for some of our structures, and then also creating those structures where the underserved counties and communities can come in for these structures as well. So, like, again, finding ways and solutions that meet the needs of community that may not have the traditional methods for coming into programs, and being able to adapt to those spaces.
Thank you. Ash?
Okay, I'm going to try to be fast. First of all, just to say that Sandhill Foundation accepts applications at any time. We have no deadlines. You can go onto our website and there's instructions how to apply. So very open door. We also welcome conversations in advance if you don't want to go through all the time it might take, hopefully not too long, to fill out the application. Welcome the conversation. Just send an email. Resend it if I don't respond right away. We have a small staff, and so sometimes I don't catch every email the first time, so I really, anyway. So, but the other thing is just internally as a structure within our enterprise, the siloing that can occur within program areas, I think is just a weird little barrier. And one of the things is that climate is impacting everything. And so we see climate-related grants coming in through every door, I guess, that we have. We have one door, but every program area. You know, the Job Train is doing workforce development around green jobs, and we have immense climate anxiety showing up and we fund a lot of mental health for youth. So we're funding programs that are supporting youth with their mental health needs. We're seeing sustainable agriculture, like the farm worker work that Alice, who's also a grantee, that Belinda talked about. It's really profound. There's every direction you can come in through youth development and bike lanes with after-school programs and advocacy efforts at the youth development level. There's so many ways to attack the climate problem, so we're really just trying to keep that in mind in everything we do internally in terms of our decision making.
Thank you so much. And you mentioned earlier about just listening, right? Inviting people to provide feedback, and I think that's really important too. Just in terms of how we lower barriers, you need to understand what those barriers are. So thank you for saying that as well.
You know, it's off, and there we go. Just one little add on that is the feedback loop. I mean, I'm thinking about the community is asked for its opinion, and then do we actually then come back to that community members and reflect the decisions that have been made? Do they get to then hear the whole process, or is it just extractive? Right, that we can't have.
Thank you for saying that. Okay, we're going to close the panel with one last question, and 30 seconds each. And what I would love to hear from each of you is what your commitment is to support the success of the local climate resilience movement. And we'll just go in order, starting with Supervisor Corzo.
Sure thing. So I am very committed to continuing to support our local climate resilience movement. Part of my commitment is really being committed to continuing to learn and to, you know, like I said several times, use my platform. I want to give a quick example of that. You know, I had a meeting with Anna from Thrive and I learned about soft story retrofitting. And then in a board meeting, I had the opportunity to advocate for our 2 new Department of Emergency Management employees to really integrate that into their work. And, you know, I don't think if Anna hadn't shared that, I wouldn't have been able to do that. So, you know, I'm committed to keeping an open door, and if you have ideas, if you want to see something happen in our county, please reach out to me. I'm all ears. Thank you.
Oh, at Sandhill Foundation, we're committed to not going away. We're in it for the long haul, and we have an open door, as I said, and we're not going anywhere.
The Strategic Growth Council just released one of our first strategic plans. It's really doubling down our investments and commitments to climate emergencies and to have a people-first organization. Again, our council members are sitting at the secretary level for most state governance, and so they're all doubling down on their commitment to the work that we've spearheaded, being in lockstep with how do we address this from all angles, as you mentioned earlier, housing, transportation, food, agriculture, land preservation. And then I would also say, for me personally, is making sure that the programs that are under my purview and the programs within SGC are really adaptive and inclusive, really expanding beyond kind of equity discussion talking points, that really embedding how we're addressing the communities that are most harmed, really putting the racial lens into the programmatic funding opportunities, as well as thinking about how do we address and incorporate all of our planning and programs to meet the needs of our youth and our aging populations, as well as making it more accessible for all community needs.
Well, we've been here for 100 years, and I think we'd like to be here for the next 100 years. So that's the plan. But I think what I'd like to be is more of a hometown utility for the communities we serve that's responsive and reflective of the communities where we provide energy, whatever form that takes over the next 100 years.
Thank you. Can we get a round of applause for our great panelists today? I know I'm going to walk away with a lot to process from that.